Welcome to Williams in the Word and my Kerry's Corner Bible study. In the past, we've done a couple of different studies since we started this channel, and primarily we talked about for the first several weeks spiritual warfare. And then for the last few weeks, we've talked about a study of baptism. And today, I'm going to dive into a study of the book of Revelation. Now, this study may take us some time because the last time I taught this in a church setting, it took almost a whole year to go through the book of Revelation because not only is the book very long, the material is very dense. And what I mean by that is that it's difficult. It's difficult material. I mean, I think everyone who's tried to dig deeper into Bible study has come to the realization when they hit Revelation that, wow, this book is not for the, I guess you'd say, new to the faith or immature in their faith. It's for those who have moved past the milk of the word and are now feasting upon the meat of the word, as the illustration would be put forth in the book of Hebrews. Because the book of Revelation is written in what we call apocalyptic language. Now, there are three books of the Bible that contains some of this figurative or apocalyptic language. There's of course the book of Daniel, the last half is written in apocalyptic language. The book of Ezekiel, the stuff about the valley of dry bones, and so many other figures in there are apocalyptic. But then the most symbolic, the most figure laden of all the books of the Bible is the book of Revelation. And it can be very difficult. And it's also difficult because there are so many interpretations. And I mean, you're going to go and you're going to hear entire doctrines that are built upon stuff in the book of Revelation, and you might read it and say, it doesn't seem to be saying that to me at all. But that's because it's not written in literal, very easy to read, interpret, and understand type of language. Therefore, it makes it kind of lends itself to people being able to come up with all sorts of interpretations. So I want to say at the outset of this, even though I have studied the book of Revelation, I have taught and written material on this for 30 plus years. And I currently teach a doctoral course on the book of Revelation. I still would not consider myself to be a subject expert because I don't know that anyone's a subject expert when it comes to conclusions. Now, they might be, and maybe I would fall into this category of understanding the culture in which it was written, to understanding the possibilities as far as interpretations and understanding the figures and how they weave together with other figures in the book. But I mean, when it comes to saying assuredly with absolute confidence, this is what this means. I see that all the time in books that I've read on Revelation, and to me it just kind of smacks of arrogance because this is a book that's very difficult. Perhaps God meant it, and it seems like he must have, to be somewhat vague where we have to interpret. But yet there are themes throughout the book. There are overarching messages that, regardless of how you interpret individual figures in the book, it still comes across. And I'll just tell you the basic theme of the book as we get started. It is that we, as God's people, we win because Jesus wins. And it is a magnificent book of encouragement. I mean, as long as you don't get bogged down in the details and in the specific interpretations. So, as we dive into the book, let's go ahead and start moving through some of our slides here. Our class schedule, and we may not follow this exactly because it's gonna be how much I can get in approximately a 30-minute session. So this first lesson, like I said, each of these may take 1 week or 2 weeks, but it has to do with the background, history, and authorship of Revelation. And you have to understand those things in order to be able to have any ability to find any interpretations. Because if you don't understand the background, how can you understand the symbolism? And what I mean by that is that every culture has their own symbolic, their own, I guess you might say, little sayings that they would understand. But if you're apart from that culture and separated by time, you wouldn't understand it. Think of all the things we say, raining cats and dogs. We say things like, I mean, I'm tickled when you're laughing about something. I mean, 2,000 years from now, nobody would understand that. And that's why understanding the background, the history, and the authorship, why it was written, who it was written to, very, very important. Symbolism in the book, imagery and numbers, that's going to be super important because whereas to us, in our culture, we often associate a lot of imagery with what things like color. To them, they would associate a lot of imagery with numbers. Now we do it some with numbers, like I'm number one, we're number one. Well, there's not literally a number one on us. I mean, it's not stamped or tattooed on us. So what does that mean? Well, it simply is symbolically representing the best because that's the first, right? So, same thing, except much more extensive. In Hebrew numerology, they had extensive imagery and numbers. So, I think that's an important thing to study, and we'll do that as well. Chapter 1 through 8 will be John's introduction to the Lamb. So, John, the author of the book, it's kind of undisputed that he's the author of the book. He's going to talk about Jesus, the Lamb of God. In our fourth lesson, chapter 1, 9 through 20, the vision and the charge. Then we move on to chapter 2, 1 through 11, the churches of Ephesus and also Smyrna. We have chapter 2 in our sixth lesson. We have chapter 2, verses 12 through 29, Pergamos and Thyatira. Then we have week 7, chapter 3, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. Now, all of those churches are what we call the seven churches of Asia. And it's up to that point through chapter 3 that the book is not overly symbolic. It does have some with the candlesticks and all that. But chapter 4 in lesson 8 is going to be where interpretations really start to diverge from one another. In fact, you're going to see four different basic camps of interpretation with many subsets underneath of those. And they're going to go in very, very different directions. But it all starts at chapter 4 in the throne scene because in chapters 1 through 3, it's kind of just more direct in that he's writing these letters to these churches. There's some symbolism in there, but it's not really, really heavy. But it gets very heavy starting in chapter 4 throughout really the rest of the entirety of the book. All right, so then we come to chapter 9, or excuse me, week 9, chapter 5, the sealed book and the Lamb. Week chapter 10, excuse me, week 10, yes, chapter 6, the opening of the first six seals. Week 11, chapter 7, 1 through 8, the 144,000. That's an interesting study because that is one that has been very, very prominently used to build a lot of doctrines from. So we're going to talk about that. In week 12, we'll talk about chapter 7, 9 through 17, the victorious multitude. Week 13, chapter 8, the seven seals and the seventh seal and the four trumpets. Week 14, chapter 9, the fifth trumpet, the first woe. Week 15, continuing chapter 9, the sixth trumpet. Week 16, chapter 10, the little book and the angel. And then you can read through these on your own. So I'll leave this on the screen for just a moment, but then it continues on. I mean, the book is long and the book has so many heavy symbolic themes that's why I told you in the very beginning, it's going to take us some time to get through it all. All right, so here is a map, just a basic map of what the Roman Empire looked like in the first century at the time of the writing. And pretty much we can say in the first century, because whether you date the book at an early date or at a late date, which are kind of the two different datings of the book of Revelation, and both of those things are pretty significant because if you date the book early, you're going to find different interpretations, vastly different interpretations, starting in chapter 4 and then on through the rest of the book. Then if you date the book late, and what I mean by early is in the 60s before the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the temple in Jerusalem, which is very, very important detail to that early date interpretation. Or people will date it in the 90s. That's later on during the reign of Domitian, the emperor in Rome, and that's going to make the book much more about Rome than it is about Judaism. So either of those interpretations are going to really impact everything after chapter 4. And I said that there's no disagreement because whether you're talking about early date in the 60s or late date in the 90s, both of those dating preferences put it in the first century. So the first century is really where we look when we want to understand Roman culture and Jewish culture and everything that would roll into that. So this is the Roman Empire at the time. Now, you see a few little dates at the bottom left. First triumvirate, the Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, and the furthest extent. So that you have kind of color coding here as far as how far it actually went. You can see that really it dipped down into Egypt, and then to the far east, it's going to dip way over into what today would be Iraq or Iran. In the far north, into what today is of course, Britain, and then uh, a little bit into Germany, but France for sure, some of those kind of places. And so it was a vast, vast empire. They tell us that many of the population of this world lived under the Caesars and lived under the rule of Rome. Now, those dates down in the left, bottom left, are dates that tell us what the size of the empire was in each state, but it doesn't tell us the vastness of the extent of longevity of the Roman Empire. And so let me be very clear about this. The Roman Empire is the longest lasting of any government, of any different power, of any, you could say superpower, because it was definitely, I mean, any nation that ruled the entirety of the known world at their time is a superpower. So this nation is just going to be so powerful for so very long. In fact, I mean, from our culture, we look at our country as being 250 or so years old. You can even look at places like Great Britain. I mean, it's lasted quite some time. But when you look at the longevity of the Roman Empire began in about 753 BC. Now, they weren't a full empire, but that's when their governmental systems and their city kind of rose to prominence, 753 BC. And when you ask, well, when did it fall? That's a difficult question because the Roman Empire started to divide into two in about 330 AD when Constantine, the emperor of Rome, decided to move the Roman Empire's capital over to what would be known as Constantinople. But on the map here, right below the Black Sea, there, in a place that today would be known as Istanbul, it was named Constantinople, and after the Emperor Constantine. But it's Byzantium here on this map. But he moved it over there. Well, from that point forward, you know that at that time Christianity became the dominant religion, kind of the official religion of the Roman Empire. And there became divisions little by little that took place. And so it divided into the West kind of was more Catholic, and the East was a little more, they were much more actually Orthodox in their nature. And so they began to divide. So the fall of the Roman Empire depends on which part you're talking about. We generally call the eastern portion of the Roman Empire after the division the Byzantine Empire. But that's a little bit of a misnomer because people don't know what the Byzantine Empire is. Well, let me tell you, they were Romans. In Istanbul, they had things like a Senate, they had the emperor there, they had the Colosseum, they had a Circus Maximus. They were Romans. And so in the West, because of the impact of the Gauls and others that were Germanian tribes that were invading them and corruption from within, the Western Roman Empire would fall about 476 AD. So that meant if you're counting the amount of time the Roman Empire survived from the beginning to the end, in the West, it was about 1,224 years from 753 to 476. 1,200 years. I mean, that is 5 times as long as our nation in the United States has survived. But then, if you look in the East, it lasted far longer. It lasted until they were finally conquered, and the city of Constantinople was invaded about 1453. So that's over 2,200 years. If you look at the what we would call the Eastern Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire, which is what it was. So that is just incredible. So you can see they ruled with an iron fist, absolute power over the entirety of the known world in the first century. Now, this is kind of a map of the actual city of Rome. If you've not been there, let me encourage you. It is a fantastic place for believers to go on vacation. We've been there a number of times. Um, and this is kind of you can see the dark outline around the city, and that kind of represents the walls to the city of Rome. Rome was built on seven hills. If you go there today, you'll be able to see those walls because if you look over on the far left, Vatican Hill, that's where today the Vatican is, and Vatican City, that's its own little nation within the city of Rome. But if you move over and you look at the section within the walls that are colored differently, you're going to see all the things that you would think of in with the book with the city of Rome. So you see the Baths of Constantine, you see things like the Colosseum, the Circus Maximus, all of this. Well, in that, interestingly enough, you notice over on the left side of the river, across from the Circus Maximus, there's the Jewish quarter. Today, that is the most fantastic area to go and to eat at restaurants and things of that nature. That's really a neat place today. But most of this stuff, you can still see it, at least portions of it there today. Like the Forum, you can tour that. The Colosseum, you can tour that. There's so many. The Pantheon, as you can see up in the kind of mid top left, that's still in pristine condition today. So this is the city of Rome. It was built on seven hills, and it was the seat of absolute power. And the church had a very strong presence there, as we see even in the book of Romans and in several other places in the New Testament. Here are just some pictures of some things that still exist today. That's the Colosseum in Rome. You can still tour that. The Agora Marketplace ruins. I've seen that. That's really neat. And then I wanted to kind of do a brief history of the Roman emperors because in the book of Revelation, there's going to be a lot of discussion about Roman emperors, depending on how you interpret regarding the dating of the book. So those who have a late date mindset, which is what I hold currently, that it was written in the 90s, put a lot of heavy emphasis on who was in charge in Rome. But those who have an early date still put some emphasis because there are some very compelling symbols about different horns that are growing that are representative of powers or kings. So this would certainly address this. But to understand all of this, it certainly is helpful in interpreting the book. So let's discuss a few of them. Well, the most well known of all the quote emperors, and I say quote because this first one is thought of as the first emperor of Rome, but he's really not, and that is Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar, and by the way, most of this material is taken from an ancient source called the 12 Caesars by Suetonius, which is a fantastic read. I enjoy it. I think really people who are casual readers even would enjoy it who like history because it kind of outlines all the emperors that we're going to discuss in the first century. Julius Caesar became very, very powerful. He was a co-proconsul of Rome with Pompey. And so he was that they didn't have an emperor at that time. So these were senators who were kind of the lead senators. So he was one of the two most powerful men in Rome at his time. He was an incredible general and conqueror. He conquered Gaul, which would be what we would think of as Spain and France. And he brought great wealth and influence to the empire and expanded its borders. Because of that, and because he was very generous with the people, I mean, he would give gifts and so forth and so on, he became very, very popular. His conquest and stability marked the beginning of the great age of the empire. He was about to be named like the dictator or emperor, if you will, whatever, just the supreme leader, when he was killed in 44 BC by two of his dear friends who were both senators, named Brutus and Cassius, because they feared having a king. And a bitter war then breaks out between his assassins, Brutus and Cassius, and Mark Antony, who was his dear friend and close commandant, and he was a general in his army. Mark Antony and Octavian was his adopted son, a nephew of his. So there becomes this bitter war. Well, ultimately, Mark Antony and Octavian defeat Brutus and Cassius. But then their alliance falls apart as they kind of become enemies as well. And they start to fight. And there's a lady who's pretty well known named Cleopatra who's involved in all this, the kind of the ruler, the Ptolemy ruler of Egypt. And she first is involved with Julius Caesar in a romantic way, and then later on, when Julius Caesar's gone, she becomes connected with Mark Antony, and so she and Mark Antony fight together against Octavius, who and Octavian ends up winning that as well. So Octavian defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra at Achaia in 31 BC, and the Roman Senate declared him Augustus, and he reigned in peace and prosperity from 31 BC to 14 AD. He was the first emperor to be considered divine by some, but generally rejected such. Now, I say that because depending on how you interpret the book, late date people like myself think that there's a lot of symbolism in the book regarding emperor worship. So that's why that's included in many of these slides. But he didn't really, that wasn't a big thing during Augustus. But this is the emperor who was king, the very first emperor of the Roman Empire. Now, it had been a republic and been very powerful and conquered most of the world already, but it didn't become an empire until Augustus was named the first emperor in 31 BC. And he ruled a long, long time, about 40 plus years, and he ruled through the birth of Jesus Christ. That was this period. Then it came to Tiberius. And Tiberius continued the good reign of Augustus. He ruled from 14 to 37 AD. As I said about the emperor worship, he reluctantly accepted a little bit of it, but it wasn't a big deal to him. And so he ruled, a few years there. But then you come to Caligula. Caligula ruled from 37 to 41 AD. He was the first emperor who was kind of arrogant enough to demand that people treat him as divine. He set up a shrine for himself in Rome for people to worship, and he greatly offended the Jews because he intended to place an idol of himself in their temple at Jerusalem because he didn't like their monotheism. But he died before that was done, so that kind of never became a thing. And he was murdered by two of his own guards. Now, I will say that's a consistent theme throughout all of this is that Rome was not. Now, you'll have a few, quote, dynasties like the Flavian dynasty we'll discuss coming up that would take place, and that'll be pretty significant, especially if you late date the book. But Rome wasn't really ruled by like a ruling family. It was more of a meritocracy where the strong would become the leader, the emperor in control. And then when they were perceived as a threat or crossed the wrong people or whatever it may be, it seems like the Praetorian Guard, which was the unit that was assigned to protect the emperor, would often be the ones to murder him, as is the case with Caligula. So it was kind of a precarious thing. You had absolute power, but if you abuse that absolute power, well, sometimes the people you exercise the power over might turn on you. And it was a constant reality in Rome. So it's not a job that most people would want, I would think. Claudius. Claudius ruled from 41. Oops, I'm ahead a little bit quick. 41 to 54 AD. He was considered to be a very weak ruler. He had a second wife named Agrippa, and she convinced him to adopt her son from a previous marriage. And that son's name was Nero. Now, that's one that oftentimes we've heard his name talked about in religious settings because Nero was a bad, bad guy. But he really only came to power because his mom, her political maneuverings. So she got her husband, the emperor, to adopt him. He gave some rights to the Jews, including you'll see King Agrippa, who is of the Herodian line, and Paul will stand before King Agrippa and give his defense. You'll remember. Well, he gave Agrippa back his grandfather Herod's kingdom. So that was kind of an interesting connection to the biblical account. Then we come to Nero. Nero probably came to power, as we said, through the political maneuvering of his mother. He was thought to have been behind Claudius's death. So his mother may have had Claudius killed, or Nero may have had a hand in that. We don't know. But he ruled from 54 to 68 AD, so 14 years, but 14 tumultuous and, in from some perspectives, especially Christian, terrible years. He lived in total wickedness. He went so far as having a statue of himself as the sun god put in the entryway to his palace, and this statue was taller than the Statue of Liberty. So in Rome today, if you go to the Colosseum is sitting on a place that was a big, giant man made lake that Nero built in front of his palace. And then in front of that, and the statue doesn't still exist today, but there was this giant, giant statue of himself bigger than the Statue of Liberty. So he was consumed with arrogance and pride. He persecuted Christians in Rome primarily as a scapegoat to blame for the fire of AD 64. So there's this terrible fire that burns through the city of Rome. And because Christians were this kind of very unknown to the Roman mind, strange group of people who had strange practices. And mostly the biggest strange practice they didn't understand was communion, the Lord's Supper, because they saw it from how it's described as eat the body and the blood of Jesus. They thought it was cannibalism. So they thought we were this weird cult sect of cannibals. And so they didn't start the fire as far as we know, of course, but he was just looking for anybody to blame to take the political heat off of himself. So he blamed this weird new cult in his mind called Christians. And so that's why that terrible persecution happened. And you've heard the stories about how he would string up Christians alive and burn them at his dinner parties. And he was a terrible persecutor. But his persecution was not empire wide, it was more located in and around the city of Rome, which is a kind of an important distinction. Next, we have the year of the three emperors. Now, I say the year of the three emperors because each of these three emperors actually ruled about 4 months each. So, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, all of them were overthrown or killed by their underlings. So, wow. I mean, I don't know why Otho and especially Vitellius took the job because that Galba was killed in 4 months. Otho was killed in 4 months. Why did Vitellius think he'd be any different? But he wasn't in that he was killed as well. So that's called the year of the three emperors. And then you come into what some would see, Romans would have seen as kind of a golden age. It's when many things are built, including the Colosseum, which is not originally called the Colosseum. Its official name is the Flavian Amphitheater because Vespasian is kind of the father of what's called the Flavian dynasty. There'll be three emperors in that family line. Vespasian was a great general who had in AD 69, because of the sedition of the Jews, Rome had gotten tired of it. They sent him and the army, and the legions had surrounded the city of Rome. But he was called back after Vitellius is killed to become emperor. Now, why he did that too? Well, he ended up making it a while, so and his line made it quite a few years. So he was clearly different than the previous three. He was a great general, a great warrior, and they call him back to be a strong leader to become the next emperor. So he lifts the siege of Jerusalem. He goes back and he becomes in AD 69 the new emperor. And he ruled until 79 AD, so 10 years. He had no direct conflicts with Christians, but he left his son Titus to destroy the city of Jerusalem. And in AD 70, Titus is the general who just destroys the city of Jerusalem, destroys the temple, and so forth and so on. Which leads us to Titus. Titus was a good leader from a Roman perspective who ruled just 2 years from 79 to 81 AD in the tradition of his father. It's rumored that he was killed by his younger brother, Domitian, but there's no real historical evidence of that. It's just a rumor. But Titus is significant because he is the one who destroyed the city of Jerusalem and the temple of Jerusalem and really Judaism as it had existed on all that time because all the records are destroyed and all that. So that's significant. In fact, one of the coolest things in the city of Rome today, you can still see, is the Arch of Titus still stands. And in the Arch of Titus, you can walk through this arch, and on the inside, on I don't remember which side, but if you're walking through it where you first enter it on your right hand side, there is a carving in there of Titus riding into Rome, holding the candlestick, the menorah, from the temple in Jerusalem when he destroyed it. So it's kind of neat to see that. So he only ruled those 2 years, which leads us finally to Domitian. Domitian is Titus's younger brother who ruled from 81 to 96 AD. He made others refer to him as our Lord and God. He was an arrogant man who wanted to be considered a god by everybody. He spread what we sometimes call the emperor cult to all the empire, which is basically just enforcers who go out and make people worship him, make people say that he's God, which is a problem for Christians, and why, especially those of us who date the book late, think that he holds a prominent place in much of the figures found in the book. Terrible persecution under him for the church as well. Well, that kind of takes up our time for today. And so we got about halfway through some of this introductory material. But like I said, we're going to take our time, go through. I hope it's been enlightening to you. Please put any comments down below. Please hit the like button and the subscribe button. And tune in every Wednesday morning, 11 o'clock a.m. Central, as we continue on this long journey through the book of Revelation. And I hope it's interesting, enlightening, and helpful for you. Thank you for being here at Williams in the Word and Kerry's Corner, and we will see you here next time.